Chapter 25 of Mag and Margaret, a Story for Girls, by Pansy. What else could one do? It was Margaret Lancaster's turn to cry. More bitter tears than her old schoolmate, Mag Jessup, had ever shed were following each other slowly down her cheeks. The first agony of grief and surprise and terrible disappointment were past, and she was now too worn out to do other than cry quietly. The old housekeeper, who had known her from childhood, was moving softly about the room, setting a chair straight now and then, or picking up a mislaid book; more from the habit of being busy than because there was really anything to be done. She looked pitifully now and again at the young girl over on the couch among the cushions, and at last she attempted awkwardly a word of comfort. "I wouldn't cry any more if I were you, Miss Margie. It doesn't do any good. Not after people have shed as many tears as you have. You are all tired out." "What difference does that make? There is nobody to care any more whether I am tired or not." This thought brought a fresh burst of tears; yet it was so true that the literal woman who heard it could only shake her gray head, and murmur in half undertone, "Poor young thing! It is hard, I am sure. Nobody can blame her for going on so; and she expected it all to be so different." Perhaps that was one of the bitterest drops in poor Margaret's cup of sorrow, that it was all so utterly different from any form of trouble that she had imagined could come to her. She went over it all in memory for the 100th time, as she lay there with closed eyes through which the slow tears constantly forced themselves. That morning, only 6 weeks ago, when she was going downstairs dressed for a walk, dressed in the most perfect of winter costumes, costly furs, and handsome gloves, and nodding plumes, all of exactly the right shade and shape; looking faultlessly elegant. Margaret Lancaster, the young lady who had the year before graduated with honor from Mrs. Garland's school, and learned better than to overdress her handsome body, and was a model of propriety in all things that belonged to the fashionable world. She had been unusually happy that morning, she remembered. First, because her new suit fitted perfectly, and was unusually becoming, and secondly, because that very morning her mother had consented to go abroad again soon after the holidays. As she reached the lower hall she had just planned what her traveling suit should be; then the doorbell had rung, and she had waited in the breakfast room to see whether that need interest her. She had heard the word telegram, and had rushed out to see about it; not frightened, but interested. It might be about the creams she had ordered for the evening, or a message from her friend Nettie to meet her down town somewhere. Telegrams and telephone messages were common enough. Ah, but this had been one of those terribly common ones, such as shoot over the wires somewhere every minute of every day, carrying with them misery that lasts. "It's important, lady," the messenger had said, and something in his tone had startled her and made her carry the yellow envelope to her mother instead of sending it by the maid. In 2 minutes more she knew that she was fatherless. It was a terrible blow to the girl. She had loved her father, not only, but had been extravagantly proud of his position and influence. Some of the most rose-colored dreams of her successful future had had to do with persons and places that her father's position would make possible for her to see. In all her plannings she had not for a moment thought of the possibility of death. For 3 wretched days she gave way to the violence of utterly uncontrolled grief, sure that life would have no heavier blow for her. Then one evening the family physician roused and frightened her by the announcement that he was seriously anxious concerning her mother, who had not rallied from the effects of the nervous shock as he had hoped she might, and he considered her situation critical. Margaret's love for her mother was the most unselfish feeling that she had cultivated in her selfish life. She really, for a few days, forgot herself, and became her mother's devoted attendant; never for a moment allowing herself to think that the poor, frail lady was seriously ill. She assured all the friends who hurried to offer sympathy and condolence that "Mamma was prostrated by the shock, but was slowly gaining." She believed so, poor girl, deaf alike to the doctor's opinion and to the mother's own belief, until, only 10 days from the hour that the news of her father's death reached her, people passed the house with quiet little step, and spoke low as they said, "Poor Margaret Lancaster! Father and mother both gone in so short a time." This last blow seemed for a time almost to stupefy Margaret. She shed less violent tears than she had over her father's death, but she refused to eat, or to take exercise, or even to try in a rational way to sleep. She spent her days and nights in her mother's room, declined to see any of her acquaintances, and in short seemed almost anxious to have done with this life as soon as possible. "She needs another shock to arouse her to action," said the troubled physician. "If something does not happen soon to change the current of her thoughts, she will follow her father and mother." The shock was nearer than any of them imagined. One morning Margaret's aunt, Mrs. Schuyler, who had come on at once when the telegram announcing her brother-in-law's death was received, and who had been with Margaret during all the trying weeks that followed, was summoned to a private conference with Admiral Lancaster's confidential lawyer. From him she went to see the family physician. She came home late and went directly to her room, sending word to Margaret that she was so utterly tired out that she must excuse her for the night. But she did not at once retire. Instead, she slipped on a warm wrapper and sat in her easy chair before the grate for hours, thinking and occasionally crying. She had a heavy task before her for the next day, and dreaded it. The morning following this night vigil was the one in which Margaret lay among the cushions with the housekeeper for company. It was just as the housekeeper had tried in vain to cheer her that Mrs. Schuyler entered the room. "How do you feel this morning, my dear?" she said kindly. "No different, auntie. There is nothing to make any difference with me any more, you know." Margaret had already brushed away the tears, and as she turned her great mournful eyes with heavy black rings under them toward her aunt, it was plainly to be seen that this utter abandonment to grief was wearing heavily upon the young girl. Still, Mrs. Schuyler was more than doubtful of the physician's prescription for rousing her. "It will kill her," she said to herself, as she looked at the haggard face. "I am just afraid it will kill her, but what can I do? I am under orders, and of course she must know the whole now." "My dear," she said, hesitatingly, "I hope you did not miss me too much yesterday. I was obliged to be absent such a long time. I was with Mr. Sumner, you know. Do you feel able to listen to a little business this morning?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't ever want to hear anything about it," she said. "I am like poor mamma. I neither understand business nor care anything for it. Fix everything exactly as you please." "But, my dear Margie, that will not do. You will be of age in a few months, you know, and there are matters that it is absolutely necessary for you to think about. Mr. Sumner thinks you should be told at once, and so, for that matter, does Dr. Ledwith." Margaret's eyes seemed to open wider. "I do not see why," she said wearily. "Surely it is not Dr. Ledwith's business. So long as I swallow his tonics and nervines and other stuffs he ought to be content. Even if I do not swallow them, his bill will be paid all the same. Why cannot Mr. Sumner manage just as he has always done, and not torment me? It is about money, I suppose, and what do I know of money except to have some when I want it?" "My child, you must remember that you are not a little girl any more. Every woman has to know more or less about business matters. And there is much more than money involved. Oh, my poor dear, I don't know how to tell you. I wish they had chosen somebody else." The slightest show of curiosity appeared in Margaret's eyes. She drew herself partly up from the pillows as she said, "What is there to tell, auntie? I can't think of anything important enough now to fuss over. The worst has happened to me, and nothing else matters. Has Mr. Sumner lost some of the money?" "There have been heavy losses, Margie. Mr. Sumner has known about them for years, but my poor brother hoped to recover some of the loss. Mr. Sumner says there is no hope of it. However, that is not the serious matter, dear. There is enough, much more than I wish there were, as matters stand. Margie, did my sister ever hint to you anything about the time when you were a little bit of a girl?" "We never talked very much about my early childhood. I asked her once to show me some of the things I wore when I was a baby, and she said she had none of them. I remember I scolded her a little for not keeping them. I told her I thought mothers always kept the clothes of their only child. Why do you ask me that?" "Because, my dear, I have a heavy task before me. I hoped I could prepare you a little for it, but I find I do not know how. I believe the humane way will be to tell you at once. Had you ever a hint from any one that you were an adopted child?" "Never!" Margaret sat erect now, and her eyes began to glow. "I never heard or dreamed of such a thing. Of course I am Admiral Lancaster's daughter. Auntie, what do you mean?" "My poor darling, you were just as dear to my sister and her husband as though you were their very own. I am sure of that. And they never meant you to know. But now it has become necessary. They took you to their home and hearts, Margie, when you were a little bit of a girl. I remember as if it were but yesterday. How astonished I was when my sister wrote me about you, and what a cunning little creature you were, the first time I saw you." She talked on rapidly, trying to stem the stream of questions she saw in Margaret's eyes, trying to cover her own intense embarrassment and pain by dwelling on trifling details. At last Margaret interrupted her. "Not their own child! Then I have had no father and mother all these years! Everybody has deceived me! It can't be possible!" But Mrs. Schuyler's sensitive nature was struck by these words, and she said what was perhaps the best she could say to help the girl to self-control. "Margaret, I know you are suffering, and allowance must be made for you; but even now, is deceived the word to use toward people who took you, a homeless, friendless little child, and during all these years have lavished upon you all the love and care that real parents could give? It certainly does seem to me that even at this time you have many mercies to remember." It was hours later that Margaret asked the question which Mrs. Schuyler had been fearing. "If I am not Margaret Lancaster, who am I? What name have I a right to?" "Margaret, my brother-in-law fully meant to give you a legal right to his name. He thought of you always as his daughter. I never knew until yesterday that the legal forms had been neglected." "Then I am a beggar! Well, what is my name? I insist upon knowing now all that there is to know." "Margie, I never knew myself until last night. We often talked about you in those early years, but it happened that while I knew all the circumstances, I did not hear your name. Of late years you were so entirely her own that my sister never mentioned any of these things. I think she had even forgotten the name herself." "What is the name?" The old imperious tone that belonged naturally to the girl whom Mrs. Schuyler had known as Margaret Lancaster was distinct enough. The question could not be parried longer. Your name was Jessup," she faltered. "Susan Jessup. My sister did not like the name, Susan, so she changed it very soon to Margaret, her mother's name." "Jessup!" repeated Margaret, in a tone that Mrs. Schuyler could not forget. "Susan Jessup! And that Mag Jessup who has always been well, never mind that. Is she any connection of mine?" "She is your sister, my dear, and a better educated, or finer looking sister one could not very well have. You must not blame me, Margaret. I assure you, all this is hard for me, too. I never expected to have to tell it. I learned the particulars only yesterday. It seems that my brother kept all the papers. He meant to use them, of course, in having the necessary legal papers made out, but he neglected it, that was all. Your own mother, my dear, was a very worthy woman; poor and unfortunate, but in every way worthy of respect. There is nothing about her memory to blush for. As for money, let that miserable nephew of my brother-in-law, who has been mean enough to hunt this all out, and try to slip into property that was never intended for him, have the money. With your education you can be independent of other people's money." "Other people's money!" Her own father's wealth that by and by, when time had softened her grief, Margaret Lancaster had felt, despite the careless words she had spoken about it, would be a pleasant thing to have. And now she had not a penny! And Mag Jessup, her rival not only in the history prize, but throughout her school days, was her sister! She could not bear it! She would not! "Don't!" she said sharply, putting her hands to her ears to shut out Mrs. Schuyler's attempts at soothing. "Go away! I cannot bear another word! Let me alone! Don't let any one come near me! Not any one!" she added fiercely, as the remembrance that now she had a sister rushed over her. Mrs. Schuyler turned sadly away. She did not know what to do with this fierce girl. She had been roused, certainly, but it seemed more than doubtful that she would reach a sane and healthful state of mind. Margaret Lancaster, crushed and dependent, might be more easily dealt with than Margaret Lancaster roused to fierce obstinacy. On the evening of that same day two young people sat in the music room of Mr. Duane's house and talked over this stricken girl's strange history, and the strange way in which their own lives had been suddenly linked with hers. "And to think that all these years she has been my sister!" Little Mag Jessup had uttered an exclamation somewhat like this several times before. She could not get away from the strangeness of it. Mr. Ainsworth smiled indulgently. "That feature of the situation impresses you most," he said. "Yes, how can I help it? I have grown up thinking that I had no sister, though I distinctly remember our little Susie, and the idea carefully taught me that I was always to take care of her." "Then your way is quite clear, I hope, if she will consent to it?" Little Mag looked down at the heavy gold loop she wore on her third finger, and was silent for some seconds. "Are you sure that you want it?" she asked at last. "I am sure that I want whatever best pleases you. And my first interest in you was strangely deepened by the discovery that you accepted, without argument, any situation that you believed to be right." "Of course," said Mag. "What else could one do?" Over this question Mr. Frederick laughed softly. "I think I know several people who have discovered a middle ground," he said. A week afterwards, they sat together, the two Margarets, one of them in deep mourning, and with a face out of which all the brightness had gone, yet it was a quieter face than some of her friends had expected to see. Margaret Lancaster was learning self-control at last. "It all seems so strange," she said, mournfully. "The idea of you, Mag Jessup, offering me a home! Do you remember I told you once that I presumed you would always be a servant?" She laughed a little bitterly over the memory. "Yes," said Mag softly, "and I always shall be, a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ." "I haven't even a right to my name!" burst forth Margaret again. "I can never get acquainted with myself as Susan Jessup, but I have no right to be Margaret Lancaster." "Indeed you have," said Mag very earnestly. "Do not for a moment believe otherwise. The mother who loved you and cared for you and was everything to you for so many years had a right to name you, and you were and are her daughter Margaret. It is not my name. My best and dearest friends know me as little Mag. I couldn't be called Margaret, and you couldn't be called anything else. But, Margaret, I have been motherless nearly all my life, and alone. I am truly glad to have found a sister. I shall love you very much, and I think you can love me a little after a while when you get used to me." Margaret Lancaster laughed outright. "I remember that, too," she said. "You told me, that summer when we were in the country, that you loved me. I didn't believe it then, but I do now. You were always a good little thing. It is strange that I disliked you so much. I shouldn't have done so if you hadn't been a better scholar in history than I. That seemed too absurd. I wonder you do not hate me, and I wonder that Cousin Fred doesn't. I have given you both reason enough. He isn't my Cousin Fred, is he? Mr. Frederick, you used to say, and I laughed at you for it. I couldn't call him that. I am glad I have no need. My respected brother in law that is to be! How bewildering it all is! But you are both good. You have been the only people who had any sense during this awful time. I think I shall love you, Mag Jessup, and I like the thought of having Fred for a brother." End of Project Gutenberg's Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy.